A black man in a crisp butler uniform stood quietly in front of a luxurious villa on a secluded private island. The sun glinted off the sleek helicopter that had just landed nearby. From it stepped a billionaire guest, his posture dripping with arrogance. He smirked, glanced at the butler from head to toe, and scoffed. "You must have just come from the kitchen, huh? Careful not to dirty my walkway." The butler didn't flinch. He lowered his head slightly, said nothing. But there was something in his eyes, calm, steady, unreadable. Not submission, not fear. Something else. Hours later, that same billionaire sat in a private boardroom, surrounded by unfamiliar faces in suits. The mood had shifted. He was no longer laughing. And when the butler stepped into the room again, everything began to change. Far from any mainland, nestled deep in the Pacific Ocean, lies Coral Haven, a private island untouched by the noise of the world. It is a place reserved for the ultra-wealthy, where rooms cost more per night than most earn in a year, and where everything, from the food to the air itself, feels curated. No outsiders, no press, no compromise. Only the rich, the powerful, and the very few who are both. That morning, the silence of the island was briefly broken by the rhythmic whir of helicopter blades cutting through the air. A sleek black chopper descended onto the private helipad near the main villa. As the doors slid open, a small group of elite guests stepped out, dressed in luxury fabrics, their every move surrounded by an air of importance. At the center of the group stood Richard Keller, a billionaire tech magnate from the United States. He moved with the confidence of someone used to owning every room he walked into, every conversation he joined, and every decision he made. People didn't question Richard. They catered to him. He wore a tailored linen suit, sunglasses that covered half his face, and a constant look of impatience. His reputation had preceded him. Staff whispered that he was meticulous, intolerant of error, and known for treating those who served him like little more than background noise. To him, hospitality wasn't a courtesy, it was a transaction. And he expected perfection. Waiting at the end of the landing path was a man who didn't blink at Richard's presence. Julian, the butler assigned to receive the group, stood still in his neatly pressed uniform. His skin was dark, his expression composed. Not overly warm, not cold either, just calm. He gave a small nod of greeting as the guests approached. There was grace in the way he moved, the way he positioned his hands behind his back, the way he held his posture as if he'd stood in that exact spot 100 times before and never once let the sun or the salt air disturb him. Richard looked him over, slowly, from head to toe, then narrowed his eyes. He didn't return the nod. Instead, he smirked, brief, sharp, and laced with quiet contempt. His voice came out casual, but laced with mockery. "So, what are you exactly?" he said, not bothering to hide the sarcasm, "the butler, or the driver around here?" Julian didn't answer. He simply looked at Richard for a moment, then gave a polite smile. It wasn't forced, nor was it warm. It was the kind of smile that didn't rise to the eyes, the kind that knew more than it let on. He gestured toward the path leading to the main villa, Villa Solstice. "If you'll follow me, your rooms are ready," he said, his voice steady, each word spoken clearly, professionally. There was no trace of offense, no tension. He moved ahead, leading the group like nothing had happened. Behind him, Richard raised an eyebrow, amused by the lack of reaction. "Huh," he muttered under his breath, "tough crowd." His companions chuckled softly, already sensing his mood. But Julian never looked back. And his silence, strangely, lingered in the air long after the group had begun to follow. As Richard entered the villa, he took a slow look around, his brow already furrowing. The space was immaculate, carefully curated with modern coastal design, wide glass panels framing the ocean, and polished stone floors cooled by central air. Still, he wasn't impressed. He pulled off his sunglasses, stared at the view for half a second, then muttered, almost to himself, "This isn't what I asked for." A nearby staff member tried to assist, but Richard raised his hand, signaling for someone higher. Julian approached, posture straight, hands clasped loosely behind his back. His tone was calm, professional. "This is Villa Solstice, sir. It was reserved under your name last month. The other beachfront villas are currently occupied or pre-booked for arriving guests, but I can look into possible changes in the morning." Before Julian could say another word, Richard turned, eyes sharp, lips curled in subtle disdain. "I'm not talking to the cleaning crew," he said flatly, brushing past Julian as if he were nothing more than part of the furniture. A brief, awkward pause followed, broken only by footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. Marcos, one of the property's senior managers, arrived with a practiced smile, but his eyes quickly darted toward Julian, assessing the tension in the room. "Mr. Keller, I'm Marcos," he said smoothly, "I'll do my best to help with your accommodation needs." Richard gave him a short nod, then resumed complaining about the furniture, the lighting, even the scent in the room. Julian remained present, assisting with Marcos quietly, checking availability and sending a message to housekeeping, offering small details with precision. Richard, however, continued to act as if he weren't there. Worse, he began issuing meaningless orders. "I want a towel. Not from the rack. Bring a fresh one from storage. And get me some water," he added, not looking at Julian, "still water, room temperature, with lemon. Not those with seeds." Julian nodded and left briefly, returning with the items exactly as requested. Richard barely glanced at him, but a smirk played at the corner of his lips, as if testing how far he could push. The rest of the group, watching from behind, seemed entertained. One man chuckled quietly. A woman in a white silk dress leaned toward her friend, voice low but pointed, "What's he even doing here? He doesn't match the place." Richard caught it and laughed louder than necessary. "Maybe they brought him in just to remind us what exclusivity looks like. To make sure we feel above it all." A few others laughed along, the kind of laughter meant to keep the group bonded, even if it came at someone else's dignity. Through it all, Julian showed no reaction. His face remained still, his movements precise, his voice, when needed, gentle and clear. No flare of anger, no change in tone. He simply carried on, as if none of their words reached him. And yet, there was something unshakable in the way he moved. Something not even Richard could break. Dinner at Azure Flame was meant to impress. The restaurant, perched on a low cliff overlooking the sea, glowed with soft golden lights. The breeze carried the scent of jasmine and salt, and each table was dressed in white linen and polished silver. The guests, still dressed in their evening resort wear, gathered around the largest table on the terrace, drinks already flowing, laughter growing louder with each glass. Julian appeared once more, this time in a tailored vest and gloves, moving with quiet grace as he approached the table holding a tray of wine. His steps were silent, his posture perfect. He looked like part of the setting, too composed to interrupt, too calm to be noticed, until he was. Richard spotted him immediately. His eyes narrowed, then widened slightly, not with surprise, but with irritation. He leaned back in his chair and raised his voice, loud enough for every waiter nearby to hear. "Don't let him touch my glass," he snapped. "Last thing I need is a smudge from this one." Several guests turned their heads, startled by the outburst. Others chuckled under their breath, unsure if it was a joke or something more. Julian's face didn't change. Without a word, he stepped past Richard and began pouring wine for the next guest. His movements remained smooth, steady, precise. He gave no indication that he had heard anything at all. The conversation returned, if only for a moment. A younger man in the group, half drunk and curious, looked up at Julian and asked, "How long have you been working here?" The question was light, perhaps even genuine, but before Julian could reply, Richard waved his hand and interrupted. "No one cares about a janitor's backstory," he said, his voice heavy with dismissal. There was a pause, then another voice chimed in. A man with a European accent leaned toward the woman next to him and whispered, "He probably used to be a bricklayer." She laughed, short and sharp, like a wine glass clinking on marble. That was all it took. The entire table burst into laughter. Except Julian. He stood still, expression blank, his eyes focused only on the task in front of him. He didn't flinch. Didn't look away. Didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Richard, clearly feeling emboldened, reached for his glass again. With a dramatic flick of his wrist, he knocked it over. Red wine splashed across his ankle and onto the floor. He looked down, feigned annoyance, then raised an eyebrow at Julian. "Are you just going to stand there, or do your job?" Julian stepped forward calmly. He knelt slightly, took a clean cloth from his waist, and began wiping the wine from Richard's skin and the floor beneath him. His movements were gentle but efficient, his gaze never rising, his breathing steady. The table fell silent, watching. Some smirked. Others sipped their wine, trying to mask the awkward tension with artificial ease. In that moment, they believed they had won something. That they had reduced him to where they thought he belonged. But Julian said nothing. He finished wiping the floor, folded the cloth with care, then stood up and walked away, quiet, composed, untouched. And somehow, his silence echoed louder than all their laughter. The next morning, the sun had barely climbed over the horizon when the beachfront began to stir. Waves lapped softly against the sand, and the morning air was cool with sea breeze. Julian stood near the canoes lined up for guests, speaking with two young staff members. His sleeves were rolled to his forearms, his expression focused but calm. He pointed toward the water, discussing the shift in tide, demonstrating how to adjust the ropes for stability. The staff listened closely, nodding, clearly learning from him. Then a sudden voice sliced through the quiet. "What is going on here?" Richard's tone was sharp, rising above the sound of the ocean. He walked down the wooden path toward the beach, sunglasses already in place, jaw tight with annoyance. He stopped abruptly, eyes fixed on Julian. "Who gave him permission to coordinate anything? You've got him managing technical prep now? Is that a joke?" Julian turned slowly. He didn't move closer. He didn't raise his voice. His eyes met Richard's for a second, then drifted calmly to the canoes behind him. Before he could respond, a manager from the deck above stepped forward, clearly sensing the tension. "Mr. Keller, if I may," Richard raised his hand dismissively. "Don't. I'll take this directly to the owner. This is unacceptable. I didn't come to a luxury resort to be bossed around by someone from the service team." Julian's tone remained even. "I'll make a note of your concern, sir." Richard laughed dryly, shaking his head. "Don't waste your time. I don't want notes. I want you gone. I don't want to see your face near my villa again. Not here, not anywhere on this property while I'm on it." With that, he turned to one of his private bodyguards and gave a subtle gesture. The man, dressed in a black polo and earpiece, stepped forward and stood between Julian and the beachfront path leading back to the main villa, as if drawing an invisible line. Julian didn't react. He nodded once, as if acknowledging an unfortunate formality, then quietly stepped aside. His composure didn't crack. Not in his face, not in his voice. But the other staff, watching from the edge of the beach, exchanged uneasy glances. Later that morning, Marcos found Julian near the maintenance station, flipping through the equipment logs. Marcos looked tired, frustrated. I saw what happened. That was out of line. I should have stepped in. Julian closed the folder gently. He didn't look upset, just tired in a quieter way. Let everything happen as it's meant to, he said softly. Some people need more time to see clearly. Word of the incident began to spread among the staff. Whispers passed between housekeepers, lifeguards, kitchen crews. They weren't just confused anymore. They were worried. Richard's behavior had grown harsher with each passing hour, and his treatment of Julian was no longer subtle. It was direct, deliberate, and dangerously public. Something was shifting, and everyone felt it. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, casting golden light across the beach. Richard had decided to host a private party near the water, complete with imported champagne, personalized menus, and a live acoustic trio flown in just for the evening. Cushioned loungers lined the sand, and staff moved quickly between stations, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and chilled bottles. Laughter echoed between the waves. Julian, dressed as always in professional black and white, stood nearby coordinating the flow of service. He spoke quietly to a line cook, adjusted a table setting, then stepped back into the rhythm of the evening. Richard spotted him and raised a finger, beckoning. "You," he called, pointing directly at Julian. "Bring my food yourself. I don't want anyone else touching it." Julian approached slowly. "Sir, for hygiene and kitchen safety reasons, we have a designated handler for plated food. I can have it brought out immediately." Richard's expression shifted. His eyes narrowed, his smile vanished. "That's not what I asked," he said, voice sharp. "I don't care about your protocols. I want you to carry my plate. Personally." Julian stood tall, his voice steady. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't break safety policy. It's in place to protect all guests." For a moment, the only sound was the music behind them and the wind in the palm trees. Then Richard snapped. "And this is what you call service? I'll make sure you're out of here by morning." One of the guests, a middle-aged woman who had seen the exchange, stepped in gently. "Richard, maybe it's not a big deal. He turned on her without hesitation. "No, he's not just anything. This is my party. I say how it goes." With a flare of frustration, he pulled out his phone and walked a few paces away. The call was quick, heated. "Get someone on the line who can actually fire people," he said. "That butler, Julian. I want him off the property before sunrise." Half an hour later, a senior manager approached Julian quietly near the edge of the event. His voice was low, regretful. "I'm sorry. Just for tonight, we'll need you to step back from the guest area. Temporary. We'll sort it out soon." Julian nodded. No questions, no resistance. He looked across the beach one last time, then began walking calmly toward the service path leading away from the main area. As he passed Richard, who was now surrounded by guests and drinks, Julian paused just slightly. "You may want to prepare for the 10 a.m. meeting tomorrow." Richard turned, a grin playing at the edge of his mouth. "You think I have time for a meeting with staff?" he laughed. "I don't sit down with the help." Julian gave no reply. Just a small nod, and then continued walking, disappearing into the shadows behind the torch-lit palms. That night, long after the party had started to slow and the music softened to a background hum, the staff gathered in quiet corners of the resort. Some leaned against the walls of the service corridor, others huddled near the kitchen entrance, their voices low but tense. The topic was the same on every tongue: Julian. "Who is he really?" one housekeeper whispered, glancing toward the dark garden where Julian had disappeared earlier. "How does he stay so calm, even after all that?" A young chef leaned in closer. His voice was hushed, but certain. I saw him in a boardroom a few weeks ago. He was in a meeting with the executive team. Not serving, sitting. Like one of them. That changed the energy. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was curiosity laced with doubt, and something close to fear. Marcos, who had been walking past, overheard the exchange. He paused, his face tightening. After a beat, he pulled out his phone and stepped away from the group. He dialed quickly, whispering into the receiver as he moved toward the administrative wing. While quiet speculation grew behind the scenes, Richard was still at the beach, sprawled comfortably on a lounger near the fire pit, drink in hand. The flames flickered across his face as he spoke louder with each glass. Several guests had already excused themselves, but a few lingered, either amused or too polite to leave. Richard lifted his glass and waved it dismissively. "It's laughable," he said, voice thick with alcohol. "A place like this, pretending to be exclusive, yet they hire men like that and act like it's normal." He laughed hard, then shook his head. "I don't care if he polishes silver with diamonds. This resort is slipping." No one responded. The servers stood quietly in the background, hands behind their backs, eyes averted. The few remaining guests didn't meet Richard's gaze. No one laughed this time. Then he pointed toward a passing waiter, a boy no older than 20. "You. Come here," Richard said, voice slurring slightly. The boy stepped forward, stiff with nerves. "Go into the website media folder," Richard continued. "Take down every single photo with that guy's face in it. I don't want to see him in the brochures, the gallery, nothing. You hear me?" The boy nodded quickly, eyes wide, then backed away without a word. His hands trembled as he disappeared toward the back office. The air had shifted. It was heavier now. Guests were quiet. Staff were tense. And beneath the golden glow of lanterns and firelight, it no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a storm was coming, and no one knew how close it was. Richard Keller hadn't come to Coral Haven just for sun and sea. Behind the tailored suits and casual arrogance, there was purpose. For weeks, the resort's executive team had been in talks with his representatives. They wanted his name, his wealth, his influence. The plan was ambitious, a strategic expansion of Coral Haven's brand onto a neighboring island. New luxury villas, a private yacht marina, and an international conference center that would turn the destination into a playground not just for vacationers, but for global power players. The proposal was polished, the numbers enticing, and the opportunity exclusive. Richard, known for bold moves, had agreed to hear them out in a private meeting scheduled for the following morning. When he entered the boardroom, the air shifted. He didn't acknowledge anyone. His steps were slow, measured. He wore his confidence like a second skin. Without looking up, he pulled out a chair near the end of the table, sat down, and crossed one leg over the other. He glanced around the room, uninterested, fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the polished wood. The executives were already in place, folders neatly stacked, glasses of water untouched. Some offered small nods, which Richard ignored. Then the door opened again. Julian walked in, his presence calm but commanding. His uniform was gone, replaced by a dark, tailored suit. His expression held no trace of emotion. For a moment, no one said anything. Richard looked up, then let out a scoff. His voice cut through the tension with cruel amusement. "Really? You dragged me in here to fire the butler in front of me? I'm flattered. You didn't have to make it so formal." He leaned back in his chair, chuckling to himself, clearly enjoying what he assumed was the final blow in a private joke only he understood. But no one else laughed. A senior executive at the far end of the table stood. His tone was careful, formal. "Mr. Roth," he said, gesturing toward the seat at the head of the table, "please, whenever you're ready." Richard's smile froze. He looked at the man, then at Julian, then back again, confused. Julian stepped forward without a word, sat down in the chair of authority, and opened the folder in front of him. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room slowly, landing finally on Richard. "My name is Julian Roth," he said, voice calm but clear, every syllable precise. "As of last week, I am the majority shareholder and now principal owner of Coral Haven. I have completed the acquisition of 80% of the company's equity. This meeting," he paused slightly, "will now proceed under my direction." The room fell completely silent. No shifting papers, no awkward coughs. Just stillness. Even the air felt heavier. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out at first. His confidence cracked. He leaned forward slightly, disbelief written across his face. That can't be. You were," Julian's gaze didn't waver. "I've heard enough," he said, steady as ever. "Now, Mr. Keller, let's have a serious conversation." The silence in the boardroom lingered. Julian didn't waste time. He opened a second folder, placed it gently on the table, and looked toward the screen at the front of the room. "Before we move forward," he said, voice steady, "I'd like to address a matter that concerns the integrity of this resort." The screen flickered to life. Security footage appeared, silent but clear. It began with the dinner at Azure Flame. Richard's voice, though unheard, was unmistakable. The way he pointed, the way he laughed. Julian pouring wine, receiving insults without response. Then the beach scene, Richard shouting, waving his hands, a security guard stepping forward to block Julian's path. Finally, the footage from the beach party, Julian calmly refusing to break safety protocol, Richard slurring threats and demanding his removal. No one in the room moved. Julian didn't look away from the footage. He let it play a moment longer before addressing the room again. "At Coral Haven," he said, his voice carrying more now, "we do not tolerate behavior that strips others of dignity. No title, no wealth, no ego entitles anyone to dehumanize another." The screen faded to black. A hush fell over the room, deeper than silence. A member of the executive board cleared his throat. He didn't hesitate. "I believe I speak for all of us when I say, we cannot in good conscience continue accommodating Mr. Keller." Another nodded. Then another. Within moments, it was unanimous. Julian closed the folder and looked across the table. "Effective immediately," he said, "Mr. Keller's stay is terminated. He will be escorted off the island within the next 2 hours. All arrangements will be handled with discretion, but without delay." The words dropped like stones. Firm. Unmoving. From the back of the room, someone began to clap, quiet at first, then louder. Another joined. And another. Not everyone clapped, but no one spoke up for Richard. Richard sat motionless, his face pale, lips pressed tight. The arrogance that once lived in every gesture was gone. No protest. No excuses. Just silence. Julian stood and nodded toward the team. "Thank you for your patience," he said, "and for allowing the truth to speak in its time." Richard rose slowly, his hands trembling as he gathered his belongings. He said nothing. For the first time since he'd arrived on the island, there was no smirk on his lips. No smugness in his eyes. Only disbelief. And when he walked out of the room, he didn't look back. The news spread quickly through Coral Haven, not through announcements or emails, but in glances, in whispers that passed like wind through hallways. By mid-afternoon, the island felt different. Lighter. Quieter. And when Julian stepped out of the boardroom, no longer the man people assumed he was, the change became real. One by one, staff began to approach him. At first, just a nod from a passing concierge. Then a gardener paused mid-task to straighten his back and offer a respectful smile. Soon, a small group gathered near the service path, not to ask for anything, but simply to greet him, with a kind of reverence in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Julian didn't speak much. He shook hands. He smiled. He asked one housekeeper how her daughter was doing in school. He reminded a kitchen staff member to take breaks between shifts. His tone was the same as it had always been, gentle, patient, quietly observant. There was no judgment in his words, no gloating in his posture. A young employee, still in uniform, couldn't hold his curiosity. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" he asked. "Why let us all believe you were just staff?" Julian paused. His smile was calm, almost amused. "Because I wanted to see how people treat each other when they think no one's watching," he said. "When titles aren't in the way." The group fell silent for a moment. Some nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling deep. Then others began to speak. One admitted they'd felt uncomfortable with Richard's behavior but hadn't known what to do. Another said they'd learned more about grace and dignity in the last few days than in years of training. There was no need for speeches. Just presence. And the example Julian had set without ever raising his voice. Marcos approached last. His expression was full of regret. He looked Julian in the eye. "I should have stepped in earlier," he said quietly. "I let things go too far. I'm sorry." Julian didn't hesitate. "Everyone is given chances to do what's right," he said. "The only question is when they choose to act." The wind moved softly through the palms. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of waves returned to its place as the island's heartbeat. Coral Haven settled into stillness again. The tension that had clung to its corners was gone. But what remained was stronger. A quiet understanding. A lasting reminder. Power doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes, it simply listens, and waits, for the right moment to stand. Some people choose silence not because they are weak, but because they are watching. They wait. Not to retaliate, but to understand who truly stands with them when nothing is certain. They wait for the right moment, not to speak louder, but to speak wiser. Arrogance has a way of blinding us. It convinces us that power is loud, that respect must be earned through dominance. But the truth is simpler. Respect should never have to be earned through titles. It is the minimum, the foundation of every human interaction. Never judge someone by what they wear, what they carry, or the tasks they perform. Because the one you mock, the one you dismiss without a second glance, may be the very person holding the future you're stepping into. Julian never needed to shout to be heard. And Richard didn't need more time to speak, he needed time to listen. If this story spoke to something in you, share it. Leave a comment. Tell us how it made you feel. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss the stories that challenge what we see, and remind us of what we forget.